Everyone who knew Daniel Mercer believed they understood him. They believed he was the kind of father who did what was required and nothing more. Present, responsible, efficient, and emotionally unreachable. He never raised his voice. He never disappeared. He simply existed at a careful distance, as if closeness were something to be managed rather than embraced. Isidao Tercera grew up inside that distance, learning early not to expect warmth from a man who never offered it. Over the years, that belief hardened into certainty. Daniel Mercer did not know how to love. Not in any way that mattered. It was a story everyone agreed on. Neighbors, teachers, relatives, even Sarah herself. And for a long time, there was nothing to challenge it. Nothing to suggest that what they saw was incomplete. Nothing to hint that the truth might be far more complicated than anyone wanted to believe. After his death, as Sarah began sorting through the quiet remains of his life, she came across something he had never mentioned, never explained, and never wanted to be found. It wasn't hidden with locks or warnings. It was simply waiting, untouched, exactly where he had left it. At first, she didn't understand what it was or why it existed, only that it felt deliberate, personal, and impossibly old. Whatever it was, it had been created over many years, and kept in silence for just as long. And standing there holding the weight of it in her hands, Sarah realized that if she went any further she might lose the one certainty she had carried her entire life. The belief that her father had never loved her. That Daniel Mercer was not a man people warmed to easily. He was the kind of father who attended every parent-teacher conference, but never smiled during them, who sat in the audience at school plays with his arms crossed, who nodded once when Sarah brought home straight A's, and said nothing when she didn't. He worked as a civil engineer for the county, a job that required precision, not charm, and he performed it with the same meticulous detachment he brought to everything else. His colleagues respected him. His neighbors greeted him politely, but no one would have called him a friend. Sarah's mother had died when Sarah was 3, a detail that hung over their household like permanent weather. People in town attributed Daniel's coldness to grief, and perhaps at first it had been, but grief, most people understood, was supposed to soften eventually. Daniel's never did. He raised Sarah alone, and he did so with an efficiency that felt almost mechanical. Dinner was always on the table at 6. Homework was checked every night. Doctor's appointments were never missed. But there were no bedtime stories, no spontaneous trips for ice cream, no moments when he pulled her into his lap and told her everything would be okay. When Sarah scraped her knee at age 7 and came to him crying, he cleaned the wound, applied the bandage, and told her to be more careful. When she made the honor roll in 8th grade, he said, "Good, keep it up." When she asked him, at 16, why he never told her he loved her, he looked at her for a long moment and said, "Love isn't something you say, it's something you do." She stopped asking after that. Her high school boyfriend, a kind boy named Marcus, once asked her if her dad had always been like this. They were sitting in his car outside her house, and she had just explained why she couldn't invite him inside. "He doesn't like people over," she said. Marcus frowned. "Does he even talk to you?" Sarah shrugged. "He talks. He just doesn't connect." Marcus looked at the house, at the dim light in the living room window where Daniel was surely sitting with a book or a crossword, and said, "Man, that's rough. I'm sorry." Sarah had smiled and said it was fine, but the truth was she had spent years wondering what was wrong with her, what she had done or failed to do that made her father so unable to reach for her. By the time she left for college, their relationship had calcified into routine. She called home once a week because it seemed like the right thing to do. He asked her about her classes, her grades, whether she needed money. She answered. The conversations rarely lasted more than 10 minutes. When she graduated, he attended the ceremony, shook her hand afterward, and told her he was proud of her work ethic. Not proud of her. Proud of her work ethic. She had laughed bitterly about it later with friends, but the sting had stayed. Her 20s passed in a blur of jobs and relationships, and the ordinary heartbreaks of becoming an adult. And through it all, Daniel remained exactly as he had always been. Present, reliable, and emotionally unreachable. When she got engaged at 28, she told him over the phone. He said, "That's a serious commitment. Make sure you're ready." When the engagement fell apart 6 months later, she didn't tell him for weeks. And when she finally did, he said, "These things happen. You'll be fine." No comfort, no acknowledgement of her pain, just a flat factual assessment of a man who seemed incapable of feeling anything. And yet, Sarah never stopped trying. She invited him to dinner on holidays. She sent him birthday cards. She showed up at his house unannounced sometimes, hoping that maybe, just once, he would be happy to see her. And never was. He was polite. He offered her coffee. He asked about her life in that same distant, clinical way. And then she would leave, feeling emptier than when she arrived. Her friends told her to let it go. Some people just aren't built for affection, her best friend Jenna said once. It doesn't mean he doesn't care, it just means he doesn't know how to show it. Sarah wanted to believe that, but it was hard to believe in love that never once made itself known. It was hard to believe in a father who had raised her for 30 years and never once looked her in the eye and told her she was enough. When the call came that March morning, Daniel had collapsed at his desk. The paramedics couldn't revive him. He was gone. Sarah felt a strange numbness settle over her. She made the necessary calls, arranged the funeral, wrote the obituary. She stood in his house, the house she had grown up in, and felt like a stranger. Everything was exactly as it had always been. The furniture, the books, the smell of old coffee and wood polish. But he was gone. And with him, any chance of ever understanding why he had been the way he was. At the funeral, people she barely knew came up to her and said things like, "He was a good man, and he spoke highly of you." And she nodded and thanked them and felt nothing. Because the truth was, she didn't believe them. Daniel Mercer had been a competent man, a responsible man, but not a good one. Not to her. Not in the ways that mattered. The distance between Sarah and her father had not always felt inevitable. There were moments in her childhood, brief and fleeting, when she thought she saw something else in him, a hesitation before he turned away, a softness in his eyes that vanished as soon as she tried to meet it. She remembered being 5 years old, sitting at the kitchen table while he made her breakfast. She had drawn a picture of the two of them holding hands, and she pushed it across the table toward him, waiting for his reaction. He had looked at it for a long time, longer than she expected, and then he folded it carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. "Thank you," he said. That was all, but he kept it. She knew because weeks later she found it pressed between the pages of one of his engineering manuals, preserved like something that mattered. Those moments confused her more than his coldness did, because they suggested that somewhere beneath the surface there was a father who cared, who felt something, but who had made a deliberate choice not to show it. And that choice, more than anything, was what hurt. As she got older, Sarah began to test the boundaries of his affection. She would tell him about her day in excessive detail, hoping he would interrupt, engage, ask a follow-up question. Never vid. He listened with the same polite attention he gave to everyone, and when she finished, he would nod and return to whatever he had been doing. She tried bringing home awards, certificates, anything that might earn more than his standard good work. Nothing changed. She tried the opposite approach, struggling in a class, asking for his help, hoping that need might unlock something. He helped her with the math, explained the concepts with patience and clarity, but there was no warmth in it, no sense that this was anything more than a task to be completed. In high school, Sarah began to pull away. If he wasn't going to reach for her, she decided, then she wouldn't reach for him either. She stopped trying to impress him. She stopped seeking his approval. She built a life that existed almost entirely outside their home friends, extracurriculars, part-time jobs, and when she was there, in the house with him, she was polite and civil, and nothing more. She thought it would hurt him, this withdrawal. She thought he might notice and finally ask her what was wrong. He didn't. He seemed, if anything, relieved, as though her independence confirmed something he had always believed. The night before she left for college, Sarah sat in the living room with him, the silence between them heavy and familiar. She wanted to say something, to break through whatever wall had been built between them, but she didn't know how. Finally, she asked, "Are you going to miss me?" He looked up from his book. "You'll do well there," he said. "That's not what I asked." He closed the book, set it on the side table, and met her eyes. "You're ready for this. You don't need me to tell you that. But do you want me to stay?" His expression didn't change. "What I want isn't relevant. You have your own life to live." She had gone to bed that night, feeling like she had been dismissed, like her leaving was nothing more than a logistical transition he had planned for and accepted. And in the years that followed, that feeling only deepened. Every phone call, every visit home, every holiday dinner reinforced the same truth. Her father was capable of taking care of her, but not of loving her, or at least, not of loving her in any way she could recognize. The breaking point came when she was She had just been laid off from a job she loved. Her savings were running out, and the relationship she had thought might finally be the one had ended badly. She was at her lowest, and for the first time in years, she called her father not out of obligation but out of genuine need. She told him everything: the job, the breakup, the fear that she was failing at her life. She didn't ask for money. She didn't ask for advice. She just needed him to tell her it would be okay, that she was strong enough to get through this, that he believed in her. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then he said, "You've handled worse. You'll figure it out." That was all. Sarah hung up the phone and didn't call him again for 3 months. When she finally did, it was only because she felt guilty for not checking in. He didn't mention the gap. He didn't ask why she had been silent. He simply asked how she was, and when she said she was fine, he accepted it without question. She realized then that he would never fight for her. He would never push past her walls the way she had spent years trying to push past his. And more than that, she realized he didn't think he needed to. In his mind, whatever he was doing was enough. And maybe, she thought bitterly, it was enough for him. Just not for her. But even in her anger, even in her disappointment, Sarah could never fully let go of the hope that she was wrong. That somewhere, buried deep, her father did love her. That his silence was not indifference, but something else, fear. Maybe, or shame, or some broken part of him he didn't know how to fix. She had no evidence for this hope. It was irrational, stubborn, and painful to hold on to. But she held it anyway, because the alternative that he simply didn't care was too unbearable to accept. And then he died, and with him died any chance of ever knowing the truth. Or so she thought. The weeks after the funeral were strange and disorienting. Sarah moved through his house like an archaeologist, sifting through the remnants of a life that had always felt closed off to her. She found his taxes, meticulously organized. His bills, all paid. His books, annotated in the margins, with notes that revealed a mind far more thoughtful and reflective than he had ever shown her. She found photographs of her mother, carefully preserved in albums he had never once shown her. She found her old report cards, every single one, stored in a file cabinet in his office. She found ticket stubs from her high school graduation, her college graduation, even a recital she had performed in when she was 8 years old. He had kept everything, every piece of evidence that she had existed, that she had mattered. But he had never told her, and that, somehow, made it worse, because it meant he had cared, in his own silent, impossible way. He had cared enough to keep these things, to preserve them, to hold on to them, but not enough to let her know, not enough to cross the distance he had built between them. It was in this strange, grief-tinged frustration that Sarah found the box. Then the injustice of Daniel Mercer's silence had always been a private pain, something Sarah carried alone. But in the days following his death, it became public in ways she hadn't anticipated. The funeral had been small, attended mostly by his co-workers and a few distant relatives Sarah barely knew. But afterward, at the reception held in the community center, people began to talk. And what they said made her stomach turn. An older woman, someone from his office, approached Sarah with a sympathetic smile. "Your father was such a dedicated man," she said. "Always working, always focused. I suppose he didn't have much time for family life." The implication was clear, delivered with the gentleness people use when they're trying to soften a criticism. Sarah nodded politely, but the words stung, because they weren't wrong. He hadn't made time, he had chosen his work, his solitude, his carefully controlled life, over any real connection with her. Then came Daniel's brother, Uncle Ray, a man Sarah had seen maybe 5 times in her entire life. He pulled her aside near the coffee table, his voice low and confidential. "I know it wasn't easy growing up with him," Ray said. "Daniel was, well, he was a hard man. After your mother died, he shut down completely. I tried to talk to him about it, tried to tell him you needed more from him, but he wouldn't listen. He thought providing for you was enough." Ray shook his head sadly. "I'm sorry you had to grow up like that." Sarah felt her throat tighten. She wanted to defend her father, to say that Ray didn't understand, but the truth was, she agreed with every word. Daniel had shut down. He had failed her, and now, even in death, he was being judged for it not harshly, but with a kind of sad, knowing resignation, as though everyone had always seen what she had seen, and no one was surprised. The worst moment came later that week, when Sarah met with her father's attorney to go over the will. It was straightforward. The house, his savings, his pension, all of it, went to her. She was his only heir, his only family. The attorney, a gray-haired man named Porter, who had known Daniel professionally for years, slid the documents across the desk and then paused, his expression careful. "Your father was a very private man," Porter said. "I handled his affairs for nearly 20 years, and in all that time, he never mentioned you. Not once." He said it gently, as though he were trying to prepare her for something. "I didn't even know he had a daughter until I drafted his will." Sarah stared at him, the words landing like stones. 20 years. Her father had worked with this man for 20 years and had never once spoken about her. Not to brag, not to complain, not even in passing. She had been erased from his professional life, as though she didn't exist. Porter seemed to sense her distress. "I don't mean to upset you," he said quickly. I'm sure he had his reasons. Some men just don't talk about personal matters. It doesn't mean it's fine, Sarah interrupted, her voice flat. I understand. But she didn't. She didn't understand how a man could raise a child, provide for her, keep every scrap of paper that proved she existed, and yet never once speak her name to another person. It wasn't protection. It wasn't privacy. It was erasure. And it made her feel, in a way she had never quite felt before, like she had been a burden he had carried in silence, something he had endured rather than embraced. The judgment she faced wasn't loud or accusatory. No one blamed her for her father's coldness. But everywhere she turned, people offered the same quiet, pitying condolences. It must have been hard. He wasn't an easy man. You deserved better. And each time Sarah felt the weight of their assumptions pressing down on her. They all believed the same thing she had believed her entire life. That Daniel Mercer had been incapable of love, that his distance had been a failure, that she had grown up on. And the worst part was that she had no evidence to the contrary. Nothing to point to and say, you're wrong. He did love me. Because he had never said it. He had never shown it. And now he was gone, and the only story left was the one everyone could see. A cold father and a daughter who had suffered for it. Before this goes any further, take a second and check something. If stories like this stay with you, makasure yuri, ori subscribe to Tales of Injustice Histories. Sarah tried to move on. She spent her days sorting through the house, packing up his belongings, making decisions about what to keep and what to donate. She worked methodically, the way he had taught her, and tried not to think too hard about what any of it meant. But the anger was there, simmering beneath the surface. Anger at him for dying without ever explaining himself. Anger at herself for still caring, for still wanting his approval even now. Anger at the world for looking at her with pity, as though she were a victim of something she should have escaped years ago. Her friend Jenna came over one afternoon to help her pack. They were in the garage, sorting through boxes of old tools and equipment, when Jenna said, "You know, you don't owe him anything. If you want to sell this place and never think about him again, that's okay. You've spent your whole life trying to understand him. Maybe it's time to let that go." Sarah didn't answer. She kept packing, her hands moving automatically. But Jenna's words echoed in her mind. Let it go. Stop trying to understand. Accept that he was who he was, and move on. It was reasonable advice, healthy advice, but Sarah couldn't do it. Because despite everything, despite the coldness and the silence, and the years of disappointment, there was still a part of her that believed her father had loved her. She just didn't know how to prove it. And then, 2 weeks after the funeral, she found the box in the hall closet. It wasn't hidden, exactly. It was just tucked behind a stack of old tax documents. The kind of thing you'd overlook unless you were looking for it. The box was wooden, plain, about the size of a shoebox, with a small brass latch on the front. Sarah pulled it out, set it on the floor, and Opined Italiano inside were letters. Dozens of them, maybe more, each one in a white envelope, sealed, undelivered, each one addressed to her in her father's careful, unmistakable handwriting, and each one marked with a date, her birthday, year after year, going back almost 3 decades. Sarah's hands trembled as she picked up the first one. The envelope was slightly yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. To Sarah, on her first birthday, she turned it over. The seal had never been broken. She picked up another, to Sarah, on her 10th birthday, sealed, and another, to Sarah, on her 16th birthday, sealed, every single letter, written and never sent, kept and never read. Her father had written to her every year of her life, and he had never let her see a single word. Sarah sat on the floor of the hallway, surrounded by the scattered contents of her father's closet, and stared at the box of letters. She didn't open any of them. Not yet. She couldn't, because the existence of the letters felt like both a revelation and a betrayal, and she didn't know which one was stronger. He had written to her every single year, and he had kept the letters from her. The rational part of her mind tried to make sense of it. Maybe he had written them as a way to process his feelings, never intending for her to read them. Maybe he had planned to give them to her someday, and never found the right moment. Maybe he had been afraid of what they said, of how she would react. But none of those explanations felt sufficient, because if he had cared enough to write 30 letters, he could have cared enough to hand her just one. She set the box aside and stood, her legs unsteady. The house felt different now, heavier, like the walls themselves were pressing in on her. She walked to the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water, but her hands were shaking so badly she had to set it down. The anger she had been holding at bay for weeks surged up, hot and bitter. How dare he? How dare he leave her with this, with a box full of words she might never have found? Words that might rewrite everything she thought she knew about him, about herself, about the entire architecture of their relationship. How dare he die before explaining any of it? She thought about calling Jenna, but she couldn't imagine explaining this over the phone. She thought about opening one of the letters right then, but something stopped her. A fear, maybe, that whatever was inside would be worse than not knowing. That the letters would confirm her worst suspicions, that he had loved her but had chosen not to show it. That his silence had been deliberate, a decision he had made over and over again for 30 years. Instead, she left the house. She got in her car and drove aimlessly through streets she had known her entire life, past her old elementary school, past the park where she used to play, past the library where her father had taken her every Saturday when she was young. She remembered those trips now with a new kind of pain. He would let her pick out whatever books she wanted, and he would sit in the chair by the window and read his own book while she read hers. They never spoke during those trips. She had thought, at the time, that he was bored, that he was only there out of obligation. But now she wondered if he had treasured those quiet hours, if they had been his way of being close to her without having to risk the vulnerability of words. She pulled over in a grocery store parking lot and sat there, staring at nothing. A memory surfaced, unbidden. She was 12 years old, and she had been invited to a sleepover at a friend's house. She had been so excited, but when she asked her father for permission, he had said no. No explanation, no room for negotiation. Just no. She had been furious, embarrassed in front of her friends, convinced that he didn't want her to have fun, that he was punishing her for something she couldn't name. She had shouted at him, told him he didn't care about her, and he had stood there, silent, and taken it. And then, the next morning, she had found out that the father of the girl hosting the sleepover had been arrested the night before for drunk driving. Her father had known, somehow, he had known, and he had protected her without ever telling her why. How many times had that happened? How many decisions had he made? How many silent sacrifices that she had misunderstood or never noticed at all? Sarah drove back to the house as the sun was setting. The box was still on the floor where she had left it, the letters spilling out slightly, a cascade of unopened envelopes. She knelt beside it and carefully gathered them back, stacking them in chronological order. There were 31 in total, one for every birthday, starting with her first and ending with her 31st, just a few months before he died. She picked up the most recent one. Her 31st birthday had been in January, 2 months ago. She had called him that day, as she always did, and he had wished her a happy birthday in the same neutral tone he used for everything. She had thanked him, asked if he was doing okay, and the conversation had lasted less than 5 minutes. She remembered feeling hollow after hanging up, wondering why she even bothered. And now she was holding a letter he had written to her on that same day, a letter he had sealed and placed in this box with all the others, never to be read. The humiliation of it settled over her like a weight, because it meant that all those years, all those phone calls and awkward dinners and strained visits, he had been holding something back. He had been living a double life, one where he was the distant, unfeeling father she knew, and another where he poured his heart into letters she would never see. And she had spent 30 years believing the first version was the only one that existed. She thought about the people at the funeral, their sad, knowing smiles. She thought about Uncle Ray, shaking his head and saying Daniel had shut down after her mother died. She thought about the attorney, mentioning casually that her father had never spoken her name. All of them had judged him, and she had agreed with their judgment, had carried it as her own truth. And now she was sitting on the floor with evidence that maybe, just maybe, they had all been wrong. But that didn't erase the pain. It didn't undo the years of silence, the missed moments, the loneliness of growing up with a father who refused to let her in. If anything, it made it worse. Because if he had felt all the things these letters might contain, and he had still chosen not to share them with her, then what did that say? That his fear was stronger than his love, that his pride mattered more than her happiness, that she hadn't been worth the risk. Sarah set the letter down and pressed her hands to her face. She wanted to scream. She wanted to tear the letters open and devour every word. She wanted to burn the entire box and pretend she had never found it. But most of all, she wanted her father to be alive so she could ask him why. Why he had written these letters. Why he had never given them to her. Why he had let her spend her entire life believing he didn't love her when maybe, in some impossible, infuriating way, he had. But he was gone. And the only answers she would ever get were in the box at her feet. She stood, picked up the box, and carried it to the living room. She set it on the coffee table and sat down on the couch. The same couch where her father had sat every night, reading or doing crosswords or staring into the middle distance. She looked at the letters, neatly stacked, waiting, and for the first time since his death, Sarah cried, not out of grief, but out of frustration and anger and a sorrow so deep it felt like drowning. She cried for the little girl who had wanted her father to hold her and tell her she mattered. She cried for the teenager who had stopped trying because trying hurt too much. She cried for the woman who had buried a man she thought she understood, only to discover she hadn't known him at all. And when the tears finally stopped, she reached for the first letter. Then Sarah held the first envelope in her hands for a long time before she could bring herself to open it. The paper was soft, with age, the edges slightly worn, as though her father had handled it many times over the years. The handwriting on the front was unmistakably his, precise, measured, each letter formed with the same care he brought to everything he did. To Sarah, on her first birthday. She turned the envelope over and ran her finger along the sealed flap. It had been closed for 29 years. Whatever was inside had been written when she was a baby, when her mother had been dead for less than 2 years, when her father was a young man trying to raise a daughter alone. She tried to imagine him sitting at his desk, writing to a 1-year-old who couldn't read, who wouldn't remember this moment, who had no idea her father was struggling to find words he couldn't say out loud. But she didn't open it, not yet. Instead, she set it aside and picked up another. This one marked for her 10th birthday. Then another, for her 16th. She spread them out on the coffee table, a timeline of her life, rendered in sealed envelopes. Each one represented a year, a moment, a version of herself she could barely remember. And each one had been written by a man she had thought she knew but clearly hadn't. The weight of what she had found was beginning to settle over her, not just emotionally, but physically. Her chest felt tight, her breathing shallow. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street where she had grown up, where she had ridden her bike and waited for the school bus, and wondered why her father never waved goodbye the way other fathers did. The neighborhood looked the same as it always had, but everything felt different now. The past she thought she understood was unraveling, and she didn't know how to make sense of what was taking its place. She returned to the couch and picked up the box again, examining it more closely. It was simple, unadorned, made of dark wood that had been polished smooth by years of handling. There was no lock, just a small brass latch that opened inside, beneath where the letters had been stacked, she found something else, a small, folded piece of paper, separate from the envelopes. She pulled it out and unfolded it carefully. It was a note, written in the same handwriting, but the ink was fresher, the paper newer. It was dated just 3 weeks before her father died. If you're reading this, I'm gone. I don't know if you'll ever find these letters. I've thought about giving them to you 1,000 times, and I've chosen not to 1,001. That was wrong. I see that now. But I couldn't do it. I told myself I was protecting you, that words would only complicate the choices I had to make, that keeping my distance would make you stronger. I told myself a lot of things. Most of them were lies I needed to believe so I could live with myself. These letters are the truth, or at least, they are the closest I ever came to it. I wrote them because I couldn't say the things that mattered, and I kept them because I couldn't let them go. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect you to understand. But if you want to know why I was the way I was, it's all here. Every year, every failure. Every moment I chose silence over honesty because I thought it was the right thing to do. I'm sorry, Sarah, for all of it. Sarah read the note 3 times, her hands trembling. Had known. Near the end of his life, he had known that what he had done was wrong, that his silence had hurt her, that the distance he had maintained was a failure, not a strength. And yet, even in that moment of clarity, he still hadn't given her the letters. He had written this note, placed it in the box, and left it for her to find or not find after he was gone. It was, she realized, the most cowardly and the most honest thing he had ever done. She folded the note and set it aside, her mind racing. The box had been in the hall closet, tucked behind old documents. It wasn't hidden in some locked drawer or safe. It was just there, as though he had wanted her to find it but couldn't bring himself to make it easy. As though even in death, he was leaving the choice up to her. Sarah looked at the letters again, spread across the table like pieces of a puzzle she didn't know how to assemble. She could open them, read them, learn whatever truths her father had been too afraid to tell her while he was alive. Or she could put them back in the box, close it, and let the past remain the past. No one would know. No one would judge her for it. She could walk away from this, from him, from the decades of silence and disappointment, and build a life that didn't revolve around trying to understand a man who had refused to be understood. But even as she thought it, she knew she couldn't do it. Because as angry as she was, as hurt and confused and betrayed as she felt, there was still a part of her Mobby. The same part that had kept calling him every week, that had kept showing up at his house, that had kept hoping, that needed to know, needed to understand, needed to hear, in his own words, why he had been the way he was. She picked up the first letter again, the one written for her first birthday. Her hands were steadier now, her breathing calmer. She slid her finger under the flap and carefully opened the envelope, the old glue giving way easily. After so many years, inside was a single sheet of paper, folded in thirds. She pulled it out, unfolded it, and began to read. But before she could process the first sentence, her phone buzzed. It was Jenna texting to check in. "How are you doing? Do you need company?" Sarah stared at the message, then at the letter in her hands. She typed back quickly. "I'm okay. Found something I need to go through. I'll call you tomorrow." She set the phone aside, face down, and turned off the ringer. Whatever happened next, she needed to face it alone. Just her and her father's words. Finally, after 30 years of silence, she looked down at the letter and read the first line. "My dearest Sarah, you turned 1 year old today, and I held you in my arms and couldn't find the words to tell you what you mean to me. So I'm writing them here, where it's safe, where I can't fail you by saying them wrong." Sarah's vision blurred. She blinked, wiped her eyes, and kept reading. Then, "My dearest Sarah, you turned 1 year old today, and I held you in my arms and couldn't find the words to tell you what you mean to me. So I'm writing them here, where it's safe, where I can't fail you by saying them wrong. Your mother has been gone for 10 months. Some days it feels like 10 years. Some days it feels like she just left the room and might come back any second. You look like her. You have her eyes, her smile, the same way of tilting your head when you're trying to understand something. Every time I look at you, I see her, and it breaks me and heals me at the same time. I don't know how to be your father. I don't know how to do this without her. She was the one who knew how to love out loud, how to make people feel safe and wanted and enough. I'm not built that way. I never have been. But I need you to know that I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anything. You are the only good thing left in my world, and I would do anything to protect you, to make sure you grow up strong and capable and ready for whatever comes. I'm writing this because I'm afraid that if I let myself feel too much, if I let myself be soft with you, I'll fail. I'll make decisions based on emotion instead of reason, and I'll put you in danger. Your mother died because I wasn't careful enough. We were driving home from dinner, and I was tired, and I didn't see the other car until it was too late. The doctor said it wasn't my fault, that there was nothing I could have done, but they're wrong. If I had been more alert, more focused, more disciplined, she would still be here. So I can't afford to be weak. I can't afford to let love cloud my judgment. I have to be the father who keeps you safe, even if that means being the father who can hold you the way you deserve to be held. I have to make the hard choices, the smart choices, and I can't do that if I'm drowning in how much I love you. I'm going to write to you every year on your birthday. I'm going to tell you the things I can't say out loud. And maybe someday, when you're older and stronger and don't need me anymore, I'll give you these letters and you'll understand. But not yet. Not while you still need a father who won't break. Happy birthday, my sweet girl. I love you more than words can say. That's why I'm not saying them." Dad. Sarah set the letter down and pressed her hand to her mouth, trying to contain the sound that was rising in her throat. Her father had blamed himself for her mother's death. For 29 years he had carried that guilt, had built his entire approach to parenting around the belief that love made you careless, that softness was a liability, that the only way to protect her was to keep his distance. She had spent her whole life thinking he didn't care, and he had spent his whole life terrified that caring too much would destroy her. She reached for the next letter, her hands shaking. This one was for her 5th birthday. "Dear Sarah, you started kindergarten this year. I walked you to the bus stop on the first day, and you looked so small standing there with your backpack, so brave and so scared at the same time. You asked me if I would miss you while you were at school, and I said, you'll be back before you know it. I saw your face fall, just a little, and I hated myself for it. But what was I supposed to say? That I would spend the whole day counting the hours until you came home, that the house would feel unbearably empty without you, that I wanted to pull you back and keep you safe forever. I can't say those things, because if I do, you'll learn to rely on me in ways that will hurt you later. You need to be independent, resilient, ready to face the world without needing constant reassurance. So I hold back. I let you think I'm fine with you leaving, even though I'm not. I let you think I'm proud of your independence, even though part of me wishes you still needed me the way you did when you were a baby. You came home that first day and told me about your teacher and your new friends and the picture you drew in art class. You were so excited, talking a mile a minute, and I listened to every word. I wanted to scoop you up and tell you how proud I was, how amazing you are, how much light you bring into my life. But I didn't. I nodded and said, "That's good. Keep working hard." And you looked disappointed, and I knew I had failed you again. But I can't stop, because the world is not kind, Sarah. It will not hold you when you re-scared or tell you re-enough when you re-doubting yourself. So I have to prepare you for that. I have to teach you to stand on your own, to trust yourself, to not need the kind of love that makes you weak. I'm writing this at my desk while you're asleep upstairs. I checked on you an hour ago. You were curled up with the stuffed rabbit your mother gave you before she died. You looked so peaceful, so perfect. I stood in your doorway for 10 minutes, just watching you breathe, and I thought about how much I love you, and how terrified I am that I'm doing this all wrong. Happy birthday, sweetheart. I hope someday you'll forgive me for loving you the only way I know how. Dad. Sarah's chest ached. She could see him now, standing in her doorway, watching her sleep, struggling with the impossible choice between showing her love and preparing her for a world he believed was cruel and unforgiving. He had been wrong, so catastrophically wrong, but he had believed he was doing the right thing. He had believed he was protecting her. She opened the letter from her 10th birthday, then her 13th, then her 16th. Each one revealed another piece of the man she had never known. He wrote about the time she fell off her bike and came to him crying, and how he had wanted to hold her but had cleaned the wound instead because he thought teaching her to be tough was more important than comforting her. He wrote about her first school dance, how he had watched her get ready and thought she looked so grown up and so vulnerable, and how he had wanted to tell her she was beautiful but had said nothing because he didn't want her to measure her worth by his approval. He wrote about the day she left for college, how he had stood in her empty room after she was gone and cried for the first time since her mother's funeral. Every letter was a confession. Every letter was an apology. And every letter made it clearer that her father had loved her desperately, achingly, completely, and had convinced himself that showing it would ruin her. She reached for the letter from her 21st birthday, her visum blurry with tears. Dear Sarah, you're an adult now. Legally, officially, completely. I thought I'd feel relieved when you reached this point. Like my job was done and I could finally let go of the fear that has been driving me for 20 years. But I don't feel relieved. I feel like I've failed you. You called me on your birthday, and we talked for 8 minutes. You told me about your classes and your part-time job and your friends. You sounded happy, or at least you sounded like you were trying to sound happy. I wanted to ask if you were really okay, if you felt loved, if you knew that every choice I made was because I thought it would make you stronger. But I didn't ask. I never ask. Because I'm afraid of the answer. I see the way you look at me sometimes, like you're trying to solve a puzzle you don't have all the pieces to. I see the hurt in your eyes when I don't say the things you need to hear. And I know I'm losing you. Maybe I lost you years ago and I've just been too stubborn or too scared to admit it. Then there's so much I want to tell you. I want to tell you that I'm proud of you. Not just for your grades or your accomplishments, but for the person you've become, kind, thoughtful, stronger than I ever was. I want to tell you that you're the best thing I've ever done. The only thing I've ever done that really mattered. I want to tell you that I think about your mother every day, and that when I look at you, I see everything beautiful about her, and none of the mistakes I made. But I don't tell you these things. I write them here instead, in a letter you'll never read, because I've convinced myself that silence is a form of love, that if I stay distant, you'll learn to be that if I withhold my approval, you'll learn to approve of yourself, that if I never say I love you, you'll never need to hear it. I was wrong. I know that now. But I don't know how to undo 21 years of being wrong. I don't know how to suddenly become the father you needed me to be all along. So I stay silent, and I watch you grow further away. And I write these letters that feel more and more like confessions to a crime I coined stop committing. Happy birthday, Sarah. I love you. I'm sorry I've never been brave enough to say it to your face. Dad. Sarah was sobbing now, her whole body shaking. She picked up letter after letter, reading them in quick succession. Her 25th birthday, when she had told him about her engagement, and he had responded with caution instead of joy. He had written that he was terrified she was rushing into something that he wanted to protect her from the kind of loss he had experienced, but that he knew he had no right to interfere. Her 28th birthday, after the engagement had fallen apart, he had written that he wanted to drive to her apartment and hold her while she cried, but that he was afraid she wouldn't let him, that he had lost the right to comfort her years ago. And then she reached the final letter, the one for her 31st birthday, written just 2 months before he died. My dearest Sarah, this is the 31st letter I've written to you, and it will probably be the last, not because I'm planning to stop, but because I can feel my body failing in ways I can't ignore anymore. My doctor tells me my heart is weak. The irony is not lost on me. I've been thinking a lot about these letters lately, about why I wrote them and why I never gave them to you. And I've realized something that should have been obvious all along. I was a coward. I told myself I was protecting you, that my silence was a form of strength, that keeping my distance would make you resilient. But the truth is, I was protecting myself. I was afraid that if I let you see how much I loved you, you would see how much I needed you, and that terrified me more than anything. Your mother's death broke something in me. I thought if I could control everything, my emotions, my decisions, my relationships, I could prevent anything bad from ever happening again. But all I did was push away the one person who mattered most. I spent 30 years trying to make you strong enough to survive without me, and in the process, I made sure you never knew you didn't have to. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it, but I need you to know that every cold response, every distant gesture, every time I failed to tell you I loved you, it wasn't because I didn't. It was because I loved you so much it scared me, and instead of facing that fear, primera raine, from Italiano, I ran from you. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you found these letters. I don't know if that makes me relieved or ashamed, maybe both. I hope they help you understand. I hope they don't just make things worse. Mostly, I hope you know that you were loved, even when it didn't feel like it. Especially when it didn't feel like it. You deserved a better father. I'm sorry I couldn't be him. I love you, Sarah. I always have. I always will. Dad. Sarah sat in the silent living room, surrounded by 31 letters, and felt the full weight of her father's love and failure crash over her. He had loved her. He had always loved her. But he had been so consumed by fear and grief and a misguided sense of duty that he had hidden that love away, locked it in a box, and left her to grow up thinking she wasn't enough. And now he was gone, and all she had were these letters, these beautiful, heartbreaking, infuriating letters, and no way to tell him that she understood, that she forgave him, that she loved him too. Then Sarah didn't sleep that night. She sat on the couch until dawn, reading and rereading the letters, trying to reconcile the father she had known with the father who had written these words. The man who had never hugged her had written about wanting to hold her. The man who had never said I love you had written it 31 times. The man she had thought was incapable of emotion had poured his heart onto page after page, year after year, in a ritual of love and regret that no one was ever meant to see. By the time the sun came up, Sarah had made a decision. She couldn't keep this to herself. Not because she wanted to prove anything, but because the people who had judged her father her who had shaken their heads and said he was a hard man, a cold man, a man who didn't know how to love, needed to know the truth. Not for his sake. He was beyond caring what anyone thought, but for hers, because she had spent 30 years internalizing their judgment, believing it, carrying it as her own shame. And now she knew it was wrong. She started with Uncle Ray. She called him that morning and asked him to come to the house. He arrived an hour later, concern etched on his face, probably expecting her to need help with estate matters or funeral expenses. Instead, she handed him 3 letters, the one from her first birthday, the one from her 10th, and the one from her 21st. She didn't say anything. She just waited while he read. She watched his expression change. First confusion, then surprise, then something that looked like grief. When he finished, he set the letters down carefully on the coffee table and looked at her with tears in his eyes. I didn't know, he said quietly. Sarah, I swear to you, I had no idea. No one did, Sarah said. That was the point. Ray shook his head slowly. I told you at the funeral that he shut down after your mother died. I told you he wouldn't listen when I said you needed more from him. But I was wrong. He was listening. Ray's voice broke. He just didn't know how to do it differently. He thought he was protecting me, Sarah said. He thought distance would make me stronger. Ray wiped his eyes. Your mother was the opposite. She was all warmth, all emotion. When Cedie Daniel lost the only person who balanced him out. I should have been there for him. I should have pushed harder, made him talk, made him get help. Instead I just gave up on him. Decided he was too stubborn to change. He looked at Sarah with something close to shame. I judged him. We all did. And we were wrong. Sarah felt no satisfaction in his admission, only a deep, weary sadness. Because it didn't change anything. Her father was still gone. The years of distance were still real. But at least now, Ray knew. At least now, one person understood. Next, she called her father's attorney, Mr. Porter, and asked him to come by. He seemed surprised by the request, but agreed. When he arrived, she showed him the final letter, the one her father had written 2 months before he died. Porter read it, standing in the hallway, his briefcase still in his hand. When he finished, he was quiet for a long moment. You told me he never mentioned me, Sarah said, that in 20 years of working with him, he never once spoke about me. Porter nodded slowly. That's true. But after reading this, I wonder if... He paused, choosing his words carefully. Your father kept his personal life completely separate from his professional life. I always assumed it was because he didn't have much of one. But maybe it was the opposite. Maybe his personal life, maybe you mattered so much to him that he couldn't risk talking about it. Couldn't risk showing that vulnerability. That doesn't make it right, Sarah said. No, Porter agreed. It doesn't. But it makes it understandable. And that's not nothing. He handed the letter back to her. For what it's worth, your father was one of the most conscientious men I've ever known. He reviewed every detail of his will a dozen times to make sure you would be taken care of. He set up trusts, insurance policies, contingencies for scenarios that would probably never happen. He was obsessive about it. Porter's expression softened. At the time, I thought it was just his personality. Now, I think it was love. The only kind he knew how to show. After Porter left, Sarah sat alone again, thinking about all the ways her father had tried to love her without ever letting her see it. The savings account he had started when she was born, adding to it every month, even when money was tight. The college fund that had paid for her education without loans. The life insurance policy that had left her secure. The house, maintained meticulously, now hers. He had built a fortress of financial protection around her, had engineered her security with the same precision he brought to his work, and had never once asked for credit or gratitude. She thought about the things he had kept: her report cards, her artwork, ticket stubs, from events she had forgotten. He had archived her entire childhood, had preserved every scrap of evidence that she existed, that she mattered. But he had done it silently, privately, in a way that ensured she would never know unless she went looking. Over the following days, Sarah found herself defending her father in conversations she had once participated in with bitter agreement. When Jenna came over and said gently, "I'm glad you found the letters, but it doesn't erase what he put you through," Sarah surprised herself by pushing back. "No, it doesn't erase it," she said, "but it reframes it. He wasn't indifferent. He wasn't incapable of love. He was terrified and broken and wrong about how to handle it. That's different." Jenna looked uncertain. "I just do want you to excuse what he did, because you feel guilty now that he has gone." "I'm not excusing it," Sarah said firmly. "I'm understanding it. There's a difference." And there was. Understanding didn't erase the pain of her childhood, didn't undo the years she had spent feeling unloved, but it transformed the pain from something personal, a rejection of her worth, into something tragic. The collision of her father's love and his inability to express it. It was still painful. But it wasn't her fault, and it wasn't because she was unlovable. The moment that felt most like justice came unexpectedly, nearly a month after she found the letters. She was at the grocery store when she ran into Mrs. Palmer, a woman who had lived 3 houses down when Sarah was growing up. Mrs. Palmer had always been kind to Sarah, but had never hidden her disapproval of Daniel's parenting. "Sarah dear," Mrs. Palmer said, touching her arm with sympathy. "I heard about your father. I'm so sorry. It must be complicated for you." Before, Sarah would have nodded and changed the subject, but now she met Mrs. Palmer's eyes and said, "It is complicated, but not in the way you think." Mrs. Palmer looked surprised. Sarah continued, her voice steady. "My father loved me more than I ever knew. He just didn't know how to show it, and I think a lot of people judged him for that. Judged both of us with. Knowing the whole story, Mrs. Palmer's expression shifted, something like shame flickering across her face. "I didn't mean—" "I know you didn't," Sarah said, not unkindly. "But maybe that's a lesson. We don't always know what's happening inside someone else's life, inside someone else's heart." She walked away before Mrs. Palmer could respond. And for the first time since her father's death, Sarah felt something like peace, not happiness, not closure, but a quiet sense that the truth had been spoken, that her father's love had been acknowledged, and that the narrative people had built around him, around both of them, was finally beginning to shift. The justice wasn't loud or dramatic. There was no confrontation, no moment of vindication where everyone who had judged her father was forced to apologize. But there was a quiet reversal happening, person by person, conversation by conversation. People who had pitied her were beginning to see her differently, and she was beginning to see her father and herself differently too. He had failed her in so many ways, but he had loved her. And maybe, Sarah thought, that was the truth that mattered most. That 3 months after finding the letters, Sarah made a decision she knew her father would have hated and understood in equal measure. She began writing back. She didn't know why at first. He was gone. He would never read her words. But sitting alone in the house that now belonged to her, surrounded by the evidence of his silent love, she realized she needed to respond not for him, but for herself. She needed to close the loop he had left open, to have the conversation they had never managed while he was alive. She started with the first letter, the one he had written for her first birthday. She sat at his desk, using his pen, and wrote on a fresh sheet of paper. "Dear Dad, I read your letter, the one you wrote when I turned 1. You said you didn't know how to be my father without Mom, and that you were afraid love would make you careless. I wish I could tell you that you were wrong, that love doesn't weaken us. But I understand why you believed it. You lost the person you loved most because of a split second of inattention, and you spent the rest of your life trying to make sure it never happened again. I won't lie and say it didn't hurt, growing up the way I did. It hurt more than I know how to express, but I also won't say it was for nothing. You were right about some things. I am strong. I am independent. I learned to trust myself because I couldn't rely on your approval. I learned to stand on my own because you wouldn't hold me up. Those aren't small things. They're not nothing. But you were wrong about the most important thing. You thought showing me love would make me weak. It wouldn't have. It would have made me whole. I forgive you, Dad. Not because what you did was okay, but because I understand now that you were doing the best you could with a heart that was broken. And because holding on to anger with you gone doesn't hurt you. It only hurts me. Love you. I wish I'd had the chance to tell you that while you were still here. Sarah, she folded the letter and placed it in an envelope, sealing it the way he had sealed his. Then she put it in the wooden box alongside his letters, a response that would never be read but needed to be written anyway. Over the following weeks, she wrote more. Not for every letter. He had written some she responded to, some she simply sat with, but enough to feel like she was participating in the conversation he had started 31 years ago. It became a ritual, a way of processing not just her grief, but the complicated mixture of anger and love and understanding that came with discovering who her father had really been. Sarah also began making changes to the house. She kept most of it the way it was: his books on the shelves, his reading chair by the window, the kitchen table where they had shared so many silent dinners. But she added pieces of herself too, photographs on the walls, plants in the windows, small touches that made the space feel less like a shrine to a man who was gone, and more like a bridge between who he had been and who she was becoming. One afternoon, while organizing his office, she found something else tucked into one of his engineering textbooks: a photograph of her mother, young and laughing, holding a baby Sarah in her arms. On the back, in her father's handwriting, were the words, "The two best things in my life. I failed them both, but I never stopped loving them." Sarah sat on the floor and cried, but this time the tears fell different, not bitter or angry, but cleansing, sad and sweet at the same time. Her father had carried so much pain, so much guilt, and he had never let anyone help him bear it. He had locked it away, along with his love, and had convinced himself that was the right thing to do. Then she thought about calling Uncle Ray, sharing the photograph with him, but decided against it. Some things, she realized, could stay private. Her father had been entitled to his grief, to his secrets, to the parts of himself he kept hidden. She didn't need to excavate every corner of his inner life. The letters were enough. They had given her what she needed, not all the answers, but enough of them to make peace. As spring turned to summer, Sarah found herself talking about her father differently. When people asked about him, she no longer said, "He was distant," or "We weren't close." Instead, she said, "He loved me in the only way he knew how." It was a truth, complicated and imperfect, but true nonetheless. She also began to see herself differently. For so long, she had measured her worth against her father's silence, had believed that his inability to show affection meant she wasn't worthy of it. But the letters had shattered that belief. She had been loved, deeply, desperately, imperfectly, and if she had been worthy of that, love hidden and unspoken as it was then, maybe she was worthy of the kind of love that showed itself openly to... 6 months after her father's death, Sarah met someone. His name was Thomas, and he was a teacher at the elementary school where she had started volunteering on weekends. He was warm and expressive in all the ways her father had not been, quick to laugh and quicker to show affection. On their third date, he told her he thought she was remarkable, and she realized she believed him, not because she needed his approval, but because she had finally learned to approve of herself. When she told Thomas about her father, about the letters, he listened without judgment. "That must have been impossibly hard," he said, "growing up with someone who loved you but couldn't show it." "It was," Sarah admitted, "but it also taught me something important. Love doesn't always look the way we expect it to, and people are capable of caring more deeply than they're able to express." She paused, thinking, "I don't want to repeat my father's mistakes, but I also don't want to dismiss what he gave me, even if it came in a form I didn't recognize at the time." Thomas reached for her hand. "You're one of the most emotionally aware people I've ever met. I think you'll do just fine." And slowly, carefully, Sarah began to believe that might be true. A year after finding the letters, Sarah hosted a small gathering at the house. Uncle Ray came, along with a few of her father's former colleagues, some neighbors, and her closest friends. It wasn't a memorial, exactly more a quiet celebration of a complicated life and the legacy it had left behind. She didn't show anyone the letters. They were hers now, private and sacred, but she did talk about her father honestly, sharing stories that revealed both his failures and his hidden depths. And when people offered their condolences, their apologies for having misjudged him, Sarah accepted them gracefully, but without bitterness. "He would have hated this," she said at one point, gesturing to the room full of people. "He never wanted to be understood. He thought privacy was a form of dignity." "Do you agree?" Jenna asked. Sarah considered the question. "I think privacy has its place, but so does honesty, and I think my father could have used a little more of the latter." She smiled sadly. "But then again, he gave me something in those letters that he couldn't give me in life. The truth, and that's not nothing." As evening wound down and guests began to leave, Sarah stood alone in the living room, looking at the wooden box on the shelf where she now kept the letters. She had thought about burying them with her father, or burning them in some symbolic gesture of letting go, but she had decided to keep them instead. Not to reread obsessively, or to dwell on what might have been, but as a reminder that love is complicated, that people are flawed, and that sometimes the most important truths are the ones we're most afraid to speak. She walked to the window and looked out at the street, the same street where she had grown up, wondering why her father never waved goodbye. The light was fading, the sky turning the soft purple of early evening. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear children playing, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Sarah placed her hand on the glass, feeling the coolness against her palm, and thought about her father standing in this same spot, watching her grow up, loving her silently from behind walls he had built to protect them both. She wished he had torn those walls down. She wished he had been brave enough to reach for her, to hold her, to tell her out loud what he had written in secret. But she also understood, finally, that his love had been real, broken and hidden and wrapped in fear, but real. And that understanding, hard-won and bittersweet, was perhaps the greatest gift he had ever given her. "I love you too, Dad," she whispered to the empty room. "I wish you'd known that." And then she turned away from the window, away from the past, and stepped forward into the rest of her life, stronger for what she had lost, wiser for what she had found. And finally, after 31 years, free from the weight of believing she had never been enough. She had always been enough. She just needed to find the letters to know it. Then, before this goes any further, take a second and check something. If stories like this stay with you, makasure yuri, ori subscribe to Tales of Injustice Histories.